right, so that feels like Segway City. I'm going to get out of Tennessee since that game's not even over yet, and we're going to have a lot more to say on that. I think I hate it for Tennessee because you got to start the season with such a weird opponent. Almost seems a little unfair, but hopefully they can pull that one out. So Texas A&M. I'm going to give you a long segment here because I think you got a lot to say about this game. 44-10 at one point, and then they absolutely blew it. I feel like there were so many consecutive avoidable coaching blunders from Sumlin here. I just want you to take this one away, get us in deep, and tell us what happened. Were they avoidable mistakes? Could they have won this game once they got up early? And is now the warning bells that we were talking about in our preview show last week about Kevin Sumlin being on the hot seat, how hot is his seat after this game?
I mean, this was frustrating to watch, honestly, and I know it was probably a lot more frustrating for people that are huge Texas A&M fans. But what I think is particularly disturbing to me isn't that they didn't realize they needed to put the game away, run the clock out. It's that they did that 2 years in a row, and you know, um, you had a huge mini rant, as much as you can have a huge mini rant. I'm trying to be polite here. Last year, because Texas A&M did the same thing. They were up on UCLA. They had a chance to put it away. They just needed a couple first downs, and they kept trying to throw the ball to get a first down late. That let UCLA come back. Rosen sent it into overtime, and A&M ended up holding on for the win. This year, uh, it's baffling to me that they didn't learn that lesson. It's the same freaking opponent, same situation. You're up in the game. I think UCLA's drives took about 6.5, 7 minutes total. Those four touchdown drives in the fourth quarter. So if you consider that, all A&M needed to do was on four drives, they needed to burn 9 minutes a clock. They needed 2 minutes and 15 seconds per drive. If you have three plays that all take 40 seconds each, that's 160 seconds. Okay. So if you do that, you have the fourth play, let's say that takes 30 seconds for you to punt. They could have burned the clock out, not, basically taking a knee every snap. All they needed was one first down, right? I mean, if they ran the ball up the middle or off tackle, and really they got one first down in the entire fourth quarter, and all they did was put the ball on the ground and run it, they would not have given UCLA enough time to score to win that game. But the fact is they didn't. They put in Mond, who was a runner, and actually makes sense. There's a lot of criticism for putting in Mond. It actually makes sense because you should be running the ball, and you have a mobile quarterback, and you can run the zone read, or you can run design QB runs, which are hard to stop in those situations, and you run the ball and run the clock out. But they didn't do that. Instead, they decided to try to make Mond throw the ball. Mond threw 17 passes playing late in that game. Mond threw more passes than Starkle did, and I mean, it's just utterly baffling. I don't understand how you could let that happen. I don't understand how you could underappreciate the fact that, you're up 34 points and you just want this game to be over. But I mean, they let it happen. And yeah, and I don't know. It's just baffling to me. Again, I don't know if they just got out of rhythm. I don't know if they got confused, but the fact that Mond did not play any more than Starkle did, actually threw more passes than Starkle, even though he was 3 of 17 passing. And the team, I mean, Travion Williams averaged about 8 yards per carry in this ball game. And you know, Mond only had about 8 yards per completion, but total, they were averaging about 3 yards per attempt. So I don't even know why you ever put this ball in the air. And if they do that, they put this thing away. But as it was, they get to the fourth quarter, they've run 80, faced like 83 offensive snaps. Rosen gets to throw 59 passes. They have 25 carries. That's 84 snaps, meaningful offensive snaps run by UCLA. And A&M's run 93 offensive snaps, so you'd think they would have been able to run the ball more effectively in to put it away. I don't know. It's baffling. It's disturbing. Um, I won't say this will unravel the team, but Mond is clearly not a long term solution because he is absolutely no threat to throw the football. This has to be demoralizing for the entire football team. And I mean, the biggest takeaway for me too was the A&M secondary. We talked about this in the preview, right? Armani Watts is a pretty good football player, but when he is the star of your secondary, that's kind of a problem. They don't have a great pass rush. And I don't know. I said early in preview you had them third. I had them much lower in the SEC West. I don't see how this is going to be an overly functional team after this game and the way that they kind of imploded. I still don't see it. I mean, I don't see Sumlin lasting this season.
So for me, I think the defense sort of had a little bit of what Alabama had last year in the championship game, where they held up pretty well, but the offense went into such a shell that they were gassed. I mean, if you think about it, going into the fourth quarter, UCLA had 17 points, which is a respectable outing against a pretty good offense. But 44-17, and then offense starts turning into 3-and-out city. It put a thin defense on thin ice, and I'm not trying to be funny. I mean, they were already thin, and they don't have a lot of depth, and those guys are gassed, and they're just trying to hang on, and they just needed a couple more first downs. And kind of like Alabama last year, it never materialized. That one play, you need that field goal to not be missed. You need that 3-and-out to be actually 6 plays, 8 plays, something like that. And everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. But I don't think their coaches put them in a situation for that to be anything but what it was. Obviously, an impressive performance by Rosen, but the guy was lost for 2 quarters. I mean, he looked awful in the first half. And again, maybe he was shaking off some dust. But the interesting thing to me about Mond, and I think this speaks a little bit to the hubris of Sumlin and what we talked about last week is ultimately going to be his demise. In the offseason, it was reported widely that he had an opportunity to land Stidham that ultimately went to Auburn, as everybody knows. But he didn't want to lose out on Mond, and the word was, if you take on a transfer quarterback, we're going somewhere else. And so instead of, even though he knew he needed to inject some sort of consistency into his offense, maybe even to save his job, instead of taking the semi-known quantity that had some experience in live fire, he went with another true freshman, 5-star, hyped up quarterback. And this is just a series of guys that he's put out there too early, with too much on their shoulders, with not enough experience. And it seems like it's sort of creating this cycle for him that he's having to churn these quarterbacks and go on to the next one because he's used up, the freshman that like you said, once you start them too early, you create an artificial ceiling for them. So do you agree? Like, is there something there in terms of this reflected a pretty significant ego move on his part to not go with Stidham, or would you have gone with, the guy that maybe had the longer high upside but wouldn't help you in the immediate?
I sort of understand the move depending on where they view Stidham, and maybe that's an opportunity in a second to talk about that game. But I mean, clearly, I think it was a mistake, right? I mean, Mond looked lost and looked completely incapable of completing a pass. He's a true freshman. It's his first game. I get that. I was watching that at the end of the game where A&M needed to just get in field goal range, right? They had a fair amount of time to get in field goal range and kick a field goal to win the game. And the most baffling thing to me in this game, the entire game, was that they kept Mond in on that drive. They have Hubenak is not a great player, but he was serviceable when he came in for Trevor Knight late in the season for Texas A&M. And I felt like if they put him in, at least they had a chance to throw the football downfield and complete a couple passes. And instead they keep in a guy that had I think it was like 7 passes in a row that he'd missed. Um, and I mean, I honestly have no explanation for it. I don't know. I fundamentally do not understand why they thought this would work. And there's clearly some sort of arrogance here. They've had a massive amount of turnover at quarterbacks. He plays rotating chairs, and to put in a guy, not only did they take the guy when he probably shouldn't have come in, um, because he's too young and he's not ready yet. But then his skill set running the ball, they didn't let him use. Really, they didn't run him the way they probably should have. He barely had any carries in the game that were design carries. It felt like. I mean, he had 15 carries officially, but most of those were scrambles. And yeah, I mean, I'm baffled. And you can see why quarterbacks probably have left this school because there's clearly some issue with the way he evaluates or prioritizes what quarterbacks he should have. I don't know, and it's unfortunately for someone, it's probably going to be his undoing. I don't feel sorry for the guy given the, what 11-15 million dollar golden parachute he's going to get out of this, but yeah, it's probably going to be the thing that kicks him out of the plane.
And it's unfortunate because he's got two really good running backs in Williams and Ford that we were both super high on last year, and we talked about how maybe he could adjust his approach, sort of like last year where they were running it a lot more and not historically relying on 50 passes down the field. And in this game, it kind of played out like that. Early in the game, you had two running backs that were just tearing it up and had plenty of points on the board. And I think the way the game unraveled sort of made someone feel like his hand was forced on kind of changing over to that passing scheme. But I think they can still be a lethal team in the West, given the fact that some of these teams like Ole Miss are probably going to be down a little bit this year. I think they showed they can put up 44 points. They can run like crazy on a UCLA team that's probably not that bad defensively. Maybe three's a little high, but I think it all hinges kind of like Florida was a little demoralized against Michigan because they didn't have all their guys, their brothers in arms for that game. I think this season kind of hinges on whether or not Sumlin, who I don't know has this in him or not, can make these guys regroup, and whether or not A&M decides to make a move early. If they make a move early, the season may be over for them, and A&M fans might welcome that if it means a coaching change. But that cloud hanging over you can affect a team, can permeate a locker room. So I hope it's not. I hate to see a season end before it really gets going, and I don't think that's the case for A&M. But they've got to find something at quarterback, and they've got to find something on defense. So, all right, we've spent a lot of time dancing around the two teams that we were probably most interested in this last weekend, given the new faces and the old faces. That's Alabama and Auburn. Let's talk Alabama first. Obviously, huge game. We both predicted the score almost, the spread almost dead on. You were dead on with the spread and the score. I was close with the spread. So it kind of played out points-wise the way we anticipated it. I thought there would be more scoring than there was. There was about the exact amount of scoring that you anticipated. I think the key for me in this game was everybody is a little frustrated with the performance at quarterback. And I think that you were probably less frustrated because reading between kind of the lines from what I've heard you say about the game, you had a lot of respect for this Florida State defense, and you didn't expect a huge night from Jalen throwing the ball, if for no other reason than the fact that he's facing maybe the best defense he'll face all year. So talk about that a little bit in terms of how the game played out relative to your expectations, and should Bama fans be freaking out about Jalen Hurts, or is what we saw Saturday night kind of what you expected in a good way or a bad way?
I mean, it clearly was more or less what I expected. My going back to last week, my score preview for this one was I predicted 24-10 Alabama. So 24-7 is not far off. And my prediction for that was that, that score wouldn't necessarily be, that indicative even of how the game went, but that Alabama would be able to get a couple breaks and then have a long drive towards the end of the game to put it away. It worked differently with the turnovers, but I don't think that was too far off from the way that game went. Um, I think it is true that Florida State is a very, very good defensive football team. They are probably going to be a top five passing defense, if not top three pass defense nationally. It would not shock me for them to end up number one in the country in pass defense. And they're probably going to be top five total defense, 5 or 10, depending on, things could get screwy if the new quarterback situation, which we haven't seen, if they implode offensively, that always hurts the defensive statistics just because they're on the field so much. But uh, yeah, I mean, I didn't really think Alabama was going to be able to control this game and look pretty. It's an opening week. Nobody looks great opening week. And typically defenses are ahead of offenses at this point of the season. And Hurts was rough. It was kind of what we expected in that there were some things like the long touchdown pass to Ridley, and a couple other passes he tried to complete and were just off the mark. I think he had a long fade that was to one of the new freshman receivers that showed actual improvement. Right, last year we complained a lot that he wasn't even attempting those passes in the last few games. But at the same time, the other thing I noted was that they, with the linebacking core and the secondary they had, it was just going to be hard to have opportunities. Especially when Trey Marshall came back in the second half, and you have Trey Marshall and Derwin James and McFadden, that is just a darn good secondary FSU has, and it may well end up being, Alabama may battle for the spot of which one of those two secondaries is the best in the country. So yeah, I really thought Alabama needed to grind out this win. I thought they needed to run the ball and lean on Florida State, who wasn't huge, just physically all that big, and try to put it away. And that's pretty much what they did. Only they got a lot of benefit from field position battles. And I don't panic. I do think I was concerned by the fact that Hurts did not adjust to the blitz. We talked extensively after the LSU game last year. Dante Jackson of LSU came on corner blitzes over and over in that game, and Hurts didn't read it. If when LSU brought outside pressure, bringing more than could be blocked, Hurts did not react properly. Didn't either check the blitz at the line or make the hot read in the throw, and because of that, he was constantly forced out of the pocket. That meant they only have to cover half the field. It meant a lot of times he scrambled when he had an open guy. And if it's third and long for Alabama right now, the opponent is always going to bring a corner blitz because it's unlikely that Hurt scrambles for 10 yards on the play. So I think that's a serious concern in this ball game, and I think that's going to be a serious concern for Alabama going forward. Is can Hurts take the next step into realizing that when you have a blitzing corner, the way you beat him is not to run away from him, but to throw to the receiver he just left uncovered. Because there were several instances in that game. I think particularly it's like the first missed field goal from Alabama. Their running back, I assume it was Damian Harris, is on a wheel route. And Derwin James blitzes off the edge. When he does so, he was sitting the linebacker spot that meant Damian Harris wheels behind him and he's completely uncovered and it's a touchdown. And all Hurts has to do is look at James and look past him and realize he's just got to flip the ball over James's head. But instead he turns and tries to run away from James the opposite direction, gets run down from behind. It's a 1 yard loss, a long field goal, and they don't make it. So, I think a lot, at some level, this is also equally on the offensive line, right? If the offensive line can block everybody, none of this is a problem, and you're fine and you're good, and you move on and nobody notices. And in most of the games this year, the offensive line is going to be able to block the opponent, and you're not going to be able to tell. And Hurts will look greatly improved, I think, the next 2 weeks, because without having that pressure and with the line being able to handle things better, he's just not going to be forced in these situations. But when they play good defenses, Hurts has got to be able to make these reads, or check protection, because it doesn't matter how good you are. If you have an unchecked blitz and you don't compensate by throwing the ball past it, they're just going to increase the pressure until you snap.
And when you're playing a team like Florida State, you can't neutralize the blitz by recognizing it and running away from it. Like that just you can do that in high school and you can do that against a lot of teams Alabama played last year, but you can't do that against Florida State. And you can't do that in, you know, the biggest stage. And kind of like you talked about before on spread offenses, how they're built to beat lesser teams but struggle with really great teams. Alabama doesn't care about the next 5 games on their schedule or next 3 games on their schedule because they're not teams that are going to challenge them in any way. I haven't looked at the schedule, so don't kill me if there's some really good team on there that I haven't seen yet. These teams aren't going to challenge them in any material way. It's how you perform and how your offense can perform against these elite defenses because that's who you measure yourself against. So moving over to the Alabama defense, the next question I have is, does any of this matter? Because even with the injuries Alabama sustained Saturday night, are we looking at a defense that's so good that it may not matter if Jalen Hurts hasn't improved much in his ability to read these defenses? Maybe they're so good that they can afford to score, 20 points against against a really good team.
I think that remains to be seen. They did. I think they played very well in this game. Florida State's offensive line, though, struggled mightily last year, and the word coming out of this game is, well, clearly their line's improved significantly. Maybe that's true, but maybe it's also true that Alabama's pass rush just isn't nearly what it was last year. And they've already lost. I saw today where they lost 2 linebackers for the season. 4 linebackers were injured in that game. And I think we're going to have to see if Alabama really has a great pass rush or how much was the offensive line. I will say this, one of their big concerns was corner, where Trayvon Diggs was starting, but Levi Wallace, who was a former walk-on, had an interception, a lot of big pass breakups, and if he were to step in and solidify that corner position, I don't know. I think they may be that good because if he's playing at a high level at corner, and now they can lock up both corner positions, and Fitzpatrick played, that lets Fitzpatrick easily float around from corner to safety. Something I think I accurately predicted in this game was that for the most part, neither Fitzpatrick or Derwin James actually played safety. They played nickelback more than anything. Yeah, I mean, Alabama's going to be really tough in the back end, and they're always tough to run on. So if you can't throw on them either, then it's for the most part, it's pretty much game over for opponents.
So one of the things I noticed in this game with the defense, and I noticed it a couple of times last year as well, watching Alabama play, um, in the first half of a lot of these games, it feels like you're not watching the Alabama defense that everybody knows in terms of the one that's just an absolute terror for the quarterback. It feels like a pretty pedestrian kind of vanilla approach on defense, and we saw that again against Florida State in the first half Saturday night. There weren't a lot of exotic blitzes. They brought a little bit of pressure later on in the game, or in the first half, but the second half it looked like they really turned it up, not only in terms of sending more guys, but sending them more often in kind of zero coverage situations. Talk about that a little bit. Does Saban and Pruitt, do they have kind of a philosophy where they just throw a base vanilla defense out there almost just to see how the other offense is going to react so they'll know how to do their blitz packages and their pressure in the second half, or whether they need to do them at all, in kind of in reverse, where this is a long question, but a lot of people, what they do is they kind of throw everything out there, try to get up, get a lead, get in a good spot, and then do adjustments in the second half. But it feels like almost Alabama does the opposite of that. They kind of put it out there, and their adjustments are really just based on what they kind of wanted you to do. They wanted you to do certain things against this base defense, and then they know exactly what they're going to do in the second half. Is that something that you see them doing, or am I just kind of reading too much into it?
I think they do hold a lot of stuff back. I think I honestly don't think as much of it is trying to figure out what the other team's going to do in holding in that regard the cards to their vest to see how they need to adjust. I think a lot of it is simply they Saban in his style is really to hold a lot of stuff out until the second half. They want to keep the game close and keep an edge and go into halftime with a small lead. But they go into halftime with a small lead, having saved up a ton of stuff to just beat on you in the second half of the football game. Both with in the run, where they're just going to lean on you and pound at you in the middle the whole first half, so that hopefully you break in the second half. And then defensively, it seems like every game they come out in the second half with a lot of blitzes and looks and coverages that you hadn't seen yet. And they don't, by waiting till the second half, they just don't give teams a chance to figure it out and adjust at halftime. And like this game, they generate a couple interceptions. It they force you to put the game away a lot of times, and I think it's hard to say, right? But that's my best guess at what's going on.
It is interesting to watch an Alabama team that's been so dominant for so long because they don't tend to, at least in these big games, that a lot of times end up a lot bigger blowouts than this. I don't consider this really a blowout. In a lot of these games, these teams look like they're hanging toe to toe with Alabama. In almost all of them, you don't see Bama really jump out early in most cases. I think back to the Wisconsin game to start the season off last year, where if you're watching that Wisconsin sideline going in the halftime, early in the third quarter, they're all about it, and the next thing you know, they're blown out. And I feel like that's how a lot of these games go with Alabama, where it's sort of this feeling out phase in the first half, and then the second half is where they kind of lean on you a little bit. And it's just interesting because you'd think a team that dominant would have a lot of these games put away early, and they really don't. And based on what you're saying, it feels like it's kind of by design.
Yeah, I think it. Well, I won't say they don't want to put teams away early. They'd like to score, at the onset, but they're definitely going back to the old mold, and it's kind of what I said earlier. Um, what Kiffin did was great and wonderful. It made things flashy. They won some games with a lot of points. They won some shootouts they wouldn't have won in years prior, but they lost that physical edge that let them, you know, sort of go 10 rounds with the best opponents they could face and just sort of outlast them. And Dable may not have seemed very inventive in this game, but he did exactly what he needed to do to win. And I think that's kind of something Saban wants. Is he wants to get into that third and fourth quarter, and he's going to let his size and his depth and his machine-like conditioning, frankly, give him the edge he needs to win the game just by sheer physicality. And when Alabama leverages their depth and talent, there's just not really anybody else in the country that can go toe to toe with them. So I think I think it's something that's hard for anybody to beat, even the best teams, and I understand why he's doing it.
Yeah, and I think what's frustrating as an Alabama fan is you want to see, been waiting this whole offseason, you want to see him kind of really run out there and show all these new faces and all these weapons, and that's just not Saban's way. Saban does not care about the score. He does not care about running it up, and frankly, he doesn't always care about getting a bunch of people experience in games. And I'm not saying he could have run the score up in this game. I think he got the outcome he wanted or that he was aiming for. But even in some of these lesser opponents where you want to see that 67-2 kind of score, a lot of times you don't, because Saban cares more about working on specific things or strategizing in a specific way, not necessarily aiming for a specific score. And I think that can be frustrating as an Alabama fan. Okay, one more thing on this game, really quick. Talk to me about injuries and new faces that we've heard about all offseason are going to have to replace not only these injured guys, but we've also got some offensive players that we've heard a lot about. Should we expect to see a lot more of them come into play in this next game against Fresno, where Alabama was a 43-point favorite? And do you expect Jalen Hurts to sort of break into a little more comfort role in terms of throwing the ball?
I do expect a lot of changes very quietly, pretty much every year under Saban. The first two games, the roster tends not to resemble the last two games of the season. Part of the problem, not really a problem, but part of the issue with Alabama's depth is they often don't really seem to know who the best players are to start the year. And a lot of times they takes them about 3 or 4 games to really figure out who should be starting. And there's always a couple young guys that haven't played a lot, and they don't like to throw them into these big openers. Obviously with the injuries at linebacker, it's very concerning because those are the two best pass rushers on the team. Arguably going in the year in Lewis and Miller. And notably with them out, that puts Alabama basically at what was the fifth and sixth best pass rushers in the team last year, being that they lost Anderson and Williams. But I think they're going to have to kind of shuffle a bit because they have a lot of depth at inside linebacker. And I think you're going to see some inside linebackers, maybe Rashaan Evans, who started as a great pass rusher. He may move outside, and Mac Wilson came in because Evans had a minor injury, played inside linebacker, and it may be that Evans becomes a full-time outside linebacker and Wilson starts inside. That whole defense is probably going to look a lot different in the front seven. And then offensively, I think they keep hearing rave reviews of those freshman receivers, and number 11 for Alabama was playing a lot in that game. Judy, number 4, had one play that was called back on what was probably a bad foul there. I think it was a hold that was the guard just pancaked a guy, and for some reason they called it a holding call.
It's weird because according to Florida State fans, the only call that was missed all night were countless holding calls on Alabama that never got called, and a pass interference call that apparently cost them the game, but not the 2 interceptions. It was the pass interference call.
Well, we talk about this all the time in big games, and even more so in games where you have referees from out of conference. They don't call holding. They almost never call holding. They do not call holding in big games. Teams leverage this. They throw the ball more. They like to run on the perimeter more because they know it's going to happen. There've been I think, was it last year? No opponent had been called for a hold, or it'd be like once every 4 games an opponent was called for a hold against Alabama, and they had the lowest number of opponent penalties in the country last year. And I don't think it was any grand conspiracy. It's just in big games, referees do not like to throw many flags. Alabama tends to be a big opponent for everybody. It tends to always be a big game, so they get crews that play tight. Same thing happened here, but they did get, that what's interesting is that hold negated a throw to Judy. That caused a punt. That punt led to the pass that was pass interference. I think it was all kind of a wash, right? Because that was the end of the first half, and if that hold had been called, Florida State would have never gotten the ball to be able to cut, the pass interference that wasn't called. But anyway, no, I think the offensive style and production is going to change. And I think, based off what I've seen, there's going to be a genuine question of whether the Tonga Vailoa kid can take the starting quarterback job. And I'm going to leave that open-ended because we haven't seen him yet. But he's going to get meaningful snaps, I guarantee you, in the next few games, because there is way too much talent at receiver to have that little production in the passing game.